The ridge had no official name on the maps, just elevation markers and contour lines showing a coral limestone formation running through the center of Peleliu. The Marines would give it a name soon enough. They'd call it Bloody Nose Ridge. Some called it Death Ridge. Others just called it Hell. September 15th, 1944. The 1st Marine Division landed on Peleliu, expecting 3, maybe 4 days of fighting before the island was secured. The intelligence was catastrophically wrong. What they found wasn't a beach defense that could be overrun. What they found was a fortress carved into coral rock defended by Japanese troops using new tactics, specifically designed to kill as many Marines as possible before dying themselves. And at the center of it all was the ridge, a jagged spine of coral rising from the jungle, honeycombed with caves connected by tunnels, fortified beyond anything the Marines had encountered before. The fight for Bloody Nose Ridge lasted over 2 months. It destroyed units. It broke men who'd survived Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester. It proved that even with overwhelming firepower, even with total air superiority, even with unlimited supplies, infantry still had to go into the caves and kill the enemy face to face. This is the story of the worst fighting in the Pacific War, the ridge that wouldn't fall, the caves that wouldn't die, and the Marines who kept attacking day after day, even when victory seemed impossible. Peleliu was supposed to be a stepping stone. MacArthur was planning to invade the Philippines. Admiral Nimitz wanted to secure the Palau Islands first to protect MacArthur's flank. Peleliu was the key. Take the airfield, neutralize the Japanese garrison, move on to the next objective. Standard island hopping procedure. The intelligence estimated 10,000 Japanese defenders. The Marines had landed over 17,000 men, overwhelming numerical superiority. Naval gunfire had bombarded the island for 3 days. Carrier aircraft had struck repeatedly. Everything pointed to a quick, if bloody, victory. 3 days, maybe 4, that's what the planners said. The Japanese commander on Peleliu was Colonel Kunio Nakagawa. He'd studied every American landing since Tarawa. He knew exactly what the Marines would do. They'd land on the beaches, push inland, take the airfield, then mop up remaining resistance. That strategy had worked on every previous island. Nakagawa decided it wouldn't work on Peleliu. He wasn't going to defend the beaches. He wasn't going to waste troops in banzai charges. He was going to make the Americans pay for every yard of coral with Marine blood. His orders to his troops were simple: kill 10 Americans before you die. Make them bleed for every position. Delay them. Attrite them. Make the cost so high they'd remember Peleliu forever. The geography was Nakagawa's greatest weapon. Peleliu wasn't flat coral. The southern part had the airfield flat, open, vulnerable. But the northern interior was the Umurbrogol ridges, a complex of coral limestone formations rising up to 300 feet, covered in scrub vegetation riddled with caves. Coral limestone is soft enough to dig into, but hard enough to resist shelling. The Japanese had spent months fortifying the ridges. They'd carved caves that went hundreds of feet into the coral. They'd connected the caves with tunnels. They'd created firing positions that were invisible until you were right on top of them. Artillery positions that could fire, then withdraw into the caves before counter-battery fire arrived. Machine gun nests covering every approach. The entire ridge complex was a 3-dimensional fortress where the enemy could see you, but you couldn't see them. September 15th. The Marines landed. The beach defenses were lighter than expected. The Marines pushed inland quickly. They took the airfield on the 2nd day. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. Then they hit the ridge. The first assaults were brutal. Marines advancing upslope through scrub brush and coral rock, taking fire from positions they couldn't locate. Machine guns firing from cave mouths, then disappearing before anyone could return fire. Mortars dropping from positions that seemed to be behind the American lines. The Japanese were using the tunnel system to move artillery around, firing from different positions, creating confusion. The Marines would take a position, think it was secure, then get hit from behind because the Japanese had come up through tunnels. The heat was unbearable. Temperatures reached 115 degrees in the sun. The coral reflected heat back. Men were wearing helmets carrying 70 pounds of equipment climbing up steep slopes under fire and heat that would be dangerous even sitting still. Heat casualties were immediate and constant. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion. Dehydration was universal. Water supplies were limited. The island had no fresh water. Everything had to be brought ashore. The wounded suffered in the heat, waiting for evacuation. The dead decomposed rapidly, adding to the horror. The tactics that worked on other islands failed at Peleliu. Artillery bombardment. The Japanese were in caves. Shells had to score direct hits on cave entrances to be effective. And most caves had multiple entrances. Airstrikes bombs couldn't penetrate deep enough to reach the inner chambers. Napalm worked better, it could burn into caves, but the ridge was too broken up for effective napalm use. Naval gunfire battleships had pounded the island for days with minimal effect on the cave system. The Marines realized quickly that there was no easy solution. They'd have to take each cave individually. Infantry with flamethrowers, explosives and rifles. Go to the cave mouth. Burn or blast whoever was inside. Seal it with demolitions. Move to the next one. Repeat hundreds of times. The 1st Marines, the regiment that hit the ridges first, was destroyed in 5 days. Not defeated, destroyed. They'd landed with over 3,000 men. By September 19th, the regiment had taken 749 casualties, over half their strength. Men were hollow-eyed with exhaustion. Units that should have been company strength were down to platoon size. The officers were dead or wounded. The veterans from earlier campaigns were gone. The regiment was combat ineffective. They were pulled off the line and evacuated. The 1st Marines wouldn't fight again for months. The ridge had broken them in less than a week. The 5th and 7th Marines took over. The pattern continued. Attack uphill against invisible defenders. Take casualties. Gain a few yards. The next day, do it again. The Japanese defensive system was brilliantly designed. Interconnected positions meant that even if you took one cave, the defenders could retreat to another and continue fighting. The Americans would think they'd cleared an area, move forward and get ambushed from behind. The ridge wasn't a single position. It was dozens of mutually supporting strongpoints connected by tunnels that the Marines couldn't see or map. The flamethrower teams became the key weapon. A Marine with a flamethrower would approach a cave entrance covered by riflemen. He'd send a stream of burning fuel into the cave mouth. Sometimes the flames would reach deep enough to kill everyone inside. Sometimes the Japanese would retreat to inner chambers and wait. The flamethrower operator was the most vulnerable man in the unit, carrying tanks of napalm, moving slowly, needing to get close to be effective. Japanese snipers targeted them specifically. The casualty rate among flamethrower operators was horrific. Most didn't last more than a few days. Demolition teams followed the flamethrowers. They'd use explosives to seal caves after they were cleared, blow the entrance shut so the Japanese couldn't reoccupy. But the tunnel system meant sealing one cave didn't necessarily solve the problem. The Japanese might still have access through another entrance. The Americans had to map the entire system, find all the entrances clear, all the chambers. It was exhausting, dangerous work with no shortcuts. The psychological toll was immediate and severe. Men who'd fought on other islands said Peleliu was worse. The enemy was invisible. The terrain was nightmarish broken coral that tore uniforms and skin rocks hot enough to burn through boot soles, no shade, no water. The casualties were constant. Your friends would die, and you'd keep fighting because there was no alternative. Combat fatigue cases increased daily. Men broke. Some refused to advance. Some froze under fire. The division psychiatrist estimated that every man on Peleliu would become a psychiatric casualty eventually if the fighting continued long enough. The human mind wasn't designed for this kind of sustained combat. October brought reinforcements and a change in approach. The 81st Infantry Division Army troops took over much of the operation. The Marines had been ground down. The army units were fresh but faced the same problems. The ridge didn't care who was attacking. The caves still had to be cleared individually. The Japanese still fought from invisible positions. The heat still broke men. The only difference was that army units rotated more frequently. They'd fight for a few days, pull back, let another battalion take over. The Marines had just kept pushing until they broke. The fighting developed a rhythm: morning attack, take casualties, gain a few yards, consolidate, night, Japanese infiltration attempts, or just exhaustion and fear. Morning, attack again, days blurred together. Units measured progress in yards. Taking a single cave complex might take days and cost dozens of casualties. The Japanese defended until they were dead. Surrender was almost unheard of. The Marines would clear a position, find Japanese bodies, and know that tomorrow there would be another position just as strongly defended. Water was an obsession. The heat and exertion meant men drank their entire daily ration by mid-morning. Getting more water meant going to the rear, which wasn't always possible. Men drank from shell craters contaminated, brackish but wet. Dysentery was common. The combination of heat exhaustion, dehydration, and disease reduced combat effectiveness as much as enemy action. Men were physically falling apart even without being wounded. The wounded faced special horror. Evacuation from the ridges was difficult and dangerous. Corpsmen treating casualties were exposed to fire. Stretcher bearers had to carry wounded down steep coral slopes under fire. The heat meant wounds festered quickly. The wait for evacuation could be hours. Men died from wounds that might not have been fatal if evacuation was faster. The corpsmen at Peleliu earned their reputation. Many were killed or wounded, trying to save others. October wore on. The ridge was still there. The caves were still defended. The Americans kept attacking because retreating wasn't an option. Units were rotated. Tactics improved marginally. Better use of tanks with flamethrowers. Better coordination with artillery. Better intelligence about cave locations. But fundamentally, the problem remained unchanged. Infantry had to go into the caves. Infantry died in the caves. Progress was measured in bodies, American and Japanese. The Japanese weren't superhuman, though it sometimes felt that way to the Marines. They were starving. They were low on ammunition. They had no hope of reinforcement or evacuation. Nakagawa knew he couldn't win, but he could make the Americans pay. Every Marine killed or wounded was a victory for him. Every day the fight continued was success. His troops fought because that's what they'd been ordered to do, and because surrender wasn't culturally conceivable for most. The Americans saw them as fanatics. They were soldiers following orders and cultural conditioning that made death preferable to surrender. By mid-October, most of the ridge complex was finally in American hands. Most, but not all. Japanese holdouts remained in sealed caves. Some would fight for weeks more. Some would fight until November. The organized resistance was broken, but individual positions kept fighting. The Americans declared the island secure on October the 12th, but fighting continued. Secure meant the airfield was operational and the major positions were taken. It didn't mean the fighting was over. The casualties were staggering. The 1st Marine Division suffered 6th 526 casualties, nearly 40% of their strength. Over 1,200 Marines killed. The 81st Infantry Division added another 3,278 casualties. Total American casualties exceeded 10,000 for an island 6 miles long and 2 miles wide. The Japanese garrison of roughly 11,000 was almost completely annihilated. Only 202 prisoners were taken, many of them Korean laborers. Over 10,000 Japanese dead. The island was a charnel house. The strategic value was questionable. The airfield was useful but not essential. MacArthur's Philippines invasion succeeded without needing Peleliu as much as planners thought. Admiral Halsey had recommended bypassing the island. He was overruled. The Marines died taking an island that might not have needed to be taken. This realization added to the bitterness. The sacrifice seemed pointless. Veterans of Peleliu often expressed this: they'd done their job, but the job itself was unnecessary. The lessons were learned in blood. The Japanese had developed new tactics specifically designed to counter American firepower superiority. Don't defend the beaches where ships can pulverize you. Don't waste troops on banzai charges. Retreat to fortified positions inland. Make the Americans come to you. Use terrain caves, ridges, tunnels. Extend the fight as long as possible. These tactics worked. They made Peleliu more costly than it should have been. The Japanese would use similar tactics on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, with even more horrific results. The American tactical response evolved. Flamethrowers became essential. Demolitions teams were organized better. Tank infantry coordination improved. But fundamentally, there was no technological solution to clearing fortified caves. Infantry had to do it. The Marines learned, but the learning cost lives. Every tactic improvement came from experiencing what didn't work. The ridge was the classroom. The tuition was paid in blood. Bloody Nose Ridge broke units and men. The Marines who fought there were changed permanently. The 1st Marine Division was combat ineffective by the time they left Peleliu. They needed months to recover and rebuild. Individual veterans carried Peleliu for the rest of their lives. The author, E.B. Sledge, wrote about Peleliu in With the Old Breed, one of the greatest combat memoirs ever written. His description of the ridge is harrowing. The heat, the fear, the exhaustion, the casual proximity to death. Sledge survived Peleliu and Okinawa. He said Peleliu was worse. The physical landscape of the Umurbrogol ridges is still there. The coral formations, the cave entrances, the tunnels. Visitors can walk the ground now. It's peaceful. The jungle has reclaimed much of it, but the caves are still there. And if you look, you can still see evidence of the fighting bullet scars in rock-rusted metal, the remains of fortifications. The ridge that broke the Marines is still standing silent testimony to what happened there. The question that haunted survivors was simple. Was it worth it? They'd done their job. They'd taken the objective. They'd eliminated the Japanese garrison. But at what cost? Nearly 10,000 American casualties for an island that might not have been strategically necessary. The men who died on the ridge didn't die defending freedom in an abstract sense. They died taking caves on Peleliu because orders said, take Peleliu. The difference between necessary sacrifice and pointless loss haunted the survivors. Nakagawa committed suicide in late November after organized resistance finally ended. His orders were to hold as long as possible. He'd held for over 2 months. By his standards, he'd succeeded. He'd inflicted massive casualties. He'd delayed the Americans. He'd made them pay. Whether that service to the emperor was worth 10,000 Japanese lives is a question for historians and philosophers. Nakagawa followed his orders and his code. He made Peleliu hell for the Marines. Then he died in a cave on the ridge he'd defended. The ridge had no strategic value itself. It was just terrain. But it became the focal point of the entire campaign because taking it was necessary to secure the island and because it was perfectly suited for defense. The Marines had to take it because military necessity demanded it. The Japanese defended it because they were there, and retreat was impossible. Neither side chose the ridge. Circumstances chose it for them. But once the fighting started, the ridge became everything. Taking it became an obsession. Defending it became duty. The ridge mattered because men died for it, and once men die for something, it matters regardless of objective value. Bloody Nose Ridge was the worst of Peleliu, and Peleliu was one of the worst campaigns of the Pacific War. Not the largest other battles were bigger, not the longest other campaigns lasted longer, but concentrated horror, the ratio of casualties to size, the sheer grinding awfulness of the fighting Peleliu stands out. And at the center of Peleliu was the ridge. The coral spine that wouldn't break, the caves that wouldn't die, the position that destroyed regiments and broke men who thought they'd seen everything. The Marines came ashore expecting 3 days. They got 2 months of hell. And at the center of that hell was Bloody Nose Ridge, the place where American firepower superiority meant nothing, and infantry had to fight cave to cave, paying in blood for every yard of coral. The ridge that broke the Marines. The ridge they finally took, but never truly conquered. The ridge that stands as monument to the worst kind of fighting, necessary, brutal, close personal, and ultimately possibly pointless. That's Bloody Nose Ridge. That's what it cost. That's why the survivors never forgot.